The sun had barely cracked the horizon when Cole Merritt pulled his dusty Ford Ranger off the county road and onto the cracked dirt path that led to Margaret Calloway's property. The sky was painted in shades of burnt orange and pale violet, the kind of morning that made West Texas look like a painting, beautiful and indifferent at the same time. The land stretched endlessly in every direction, flat and golden, broken only by the occasional mesquite tree or rusted windmill standing like a skeleton against the open sky. Cole killed the engine and sat for a moment, both hands resting on the steering wheel, eyes scanning the property. The Calloway place was small, 40 acres tucked against the southeastern edge of the massive Dunfield Ranch, which swallowed nearly 12,000 acres of Harlan County. The contrast was almost painful to look at. The Dunfield side was all clean fencing, freshly painted gates, and thick Bermuda grass kept alive by an elaborate irrigation system. The Calloway side was cracked earth, a listing barn, and a farmhouse that needed paint 3 years ago. He climbed out of the truck slowly, the way a man does when his knees have absorbed too many years of hard ground. Cole was 38, lean and weathered, with calloused hands and a face that had been shaped by sun and wind and long silences. He wasn't a big man, but there was something solid about him, the kind of solidity that doesn't come from the gym, but from the land itself. He'd been working the Dunfield Ranch for 11 years, starting as a seasonal hand and working his way up to senior rank, which meant he was trusted with the cattle, the horses, and occasionally the younger hands who needed direction without humiliation. He'd known Roy Calloway for most of those 11 years. Roy had worked a parcel a few miles north before buying this small piece of land with his wife Margaret 15 years back. The two men had shared fences, shared water lines during dry summers, and shared the particular companionship of men who understood hard work and didn't need to fill silence with words. Roy had died 7 months ago, a heart attack in the South pasture, alone, face down in the dirt he loved. He was 56 years old. Margaret had called Cole the previous evening, her voice tight and controlled the way a woman's voice gets when she's trying not to fall apart. She told him the fence along the northern boundary had been cut, not broken. Cut 3 clean sections. The wire curled back like it had been done with purpose. 2 of her cattle had wandered onto Dunfield land and been impounded by Gerald Dunfield's foreman, Ray Pratt, who told her she could retrieve them after paying a $200 impound fee. Cash, no exceptions, no delays. Margaret Calloway was 61 years old and living on Roy's savings, a small life insurance policy, and the income from 14 head of cattle. $200 wasn't nothing. Cole had listened to her, said very little, and told her he'd come by in the morning. He grabbed his wire cutters, gloves, and a roll of barbed wire from the truck bed and walked the fence line until he found the cuts. It didn't take long. 3 sections, just like she said. He crouched and examined the ends of the wire, turning them in his fingers. Clan, this wasn't a deer or a spooked steer. Someone had taken their time. He spent the better part of 2 hours repairing the fence, working methodically, his movements practiced and efficient. The morning warmed quickly, the way Texas mornings do in late May, the temperature climbing from pleasant to uncomfortable before 8 o'clock. By the time he'd finished and walked back to the farmhouse, his shirt was dark with sweat between the shoulder blades. Margaret was waiting on the porch with 2 mugs of coffee. She was a compact woman with silver hair cut practical and short, sharp brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of posture that comes from a lifetime of not allowing herself to appear smaller than she felt. She handed him a mug without ceremony and studied the fence line with her eyes. "How bad was it?" she asked. "Clean cuts. 3 sections." He drank the coffee and looked at her directly. "You know what that means?" She was quiet for a moment. A mockingbird ran through its repertoire. "Somewhere in the live oak by the barn. Gerald Dunfield wants this land," she said. It wasn't a question. "He's wanted it for 20 years, Cole said. "Roy never sold. Now Roy's gone." Margaret wrapped both hands around her mug. "He sent someone out here last week. a real estate lawyer from Midland. Very polite. Offered me $400,000 for the whole property. Cole raised an eyebrow. The land was worth more than that. Maybe not on paper in the current market, but it sat directly between Dunfield's eastern pasture and the new water easement he'd been trying to secure for the past 3 years. To Gerald Dunfield, 40 acres in that specific location was worth considerably more than $400,000. What did you tell him? Cole asked. I told him Roy was buried in the back field and I wasn't leaving, she said flatly. He smiled like I'd said something funny and left his card. Cole nodded slowly. He set down the mug on the porch rail. I'm going to talk to Ray Pratt today about those 2 cattle. I'll get them back for you. Cole! Her voice caught slightly, then steadied. You don't have to do this. You work for that man. I work for the ranch, he said, which was the kind of distinction a certain kind of man makes, and means completely. I'll be back this afternoon with your cattle. He was back in his truck before she could argue. Ray Pratt was exactly the kind of foreman Gerald Dunfield preferred, loyal without being smart enough to be dangerous. Mean in a particular way of a man who'd been mediocre his whole life and resented everyone who hadn't. He was heavyset, with a permanent sunburn on the back of his neck and small eyes that never quite settled on one place. He'd been Gerald's foreman for 6 years, and in that time he developed a masterful ability to carry out his boss's instructions while maintaining the personal fiction that all of his actions were entirely his own idea. Cole found him in the equipment barn near the main house, doing something unnecessary to a tractor that was already in good repair. Cole recognized the performance, busy work designed to project authority. Those 2 Callaway cattle, Cole said, without preamble. Where are they? Ray straightened up slowly, the way a man does when he wants to communicate that your arrival is an interruption rather than a priority. East holding pen. $200 impound fee. Cash to fence was cut, Ray. Fence was down. Cattle crossed onto Dunfield land. Them's the rules. Since when do we charge impound fees to neighbors? Since Gerald said so. Ray smiled thinly. You got a problem? Talk to the boss. I will, Cole said. But those cattle go back to Margaret Callaway today. Without the fee, the smile faded. Ray Pratt had small eyes, and they got smaller. You got a lot of nerve coming in here talking to me like that. Merritt, I'm not talking to you like anything. I'm telling you what's right. Cole held the man's gaze steadily. Without aggression, without apology. That woman's husband just died. She's got 14 head. 2 of them are here because someone cut her fence. The right thing is to give them back. The right thing, Ray repeated, tasting the words like they were foreign. You've been working this ranch for 11 years, and you're in here talking to me about the right thing. I can talk to Gerald directly if you'd prefer. Ray stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned back to the tractor. Get out of my barn. Merritt. Those cattle stay until the fee's paid. Cole stood there for 3 seconds, not hesitating, just deciding, and then he walked out of the barn and directly to the main house. Gerald Dunfield was 64 years old, and he looked like a man who had never lost an argument and intended to keep it that way. He was tall, silver-haired, with a broad chest and straight spine of a man who'd been physically imposing his whole life and had built an empire on the assumption that physical and financial dominance were essentially the same thing. He had the look of old Texas money boots that cost $800, a pearl snap shirt that had been pressed that morning, a Rolex on his wrist that he never looked at because he didn't need to know what time it was. Tie arranged itself around Gerald Dunfield. He was on the covered back porch when Cole came around the side of the house, sitting in a cedar chair with a cup of coffee and a newspaper, watching the eastern pasture like a king surveying territory. He looked up when Cole appeared, and something moved behind his eyes. Recognition, and then the particular calculation of a man deciding which version of himself to deploy. Cool, he said, with what passed for warmth. What brings you up to the house? Margaret Callaway's cattle, Cole said. He remained standing, hat in hand, not because he felt subservient, but because it was good manners. And Cole Merritt still believed in good manners. Ray's got them in the East Pen. Impound fee. Gerald folded his newspaper deliberately. Her cattle crossed onto my land. After someone cut her fence. Ah, Bowsy. Gerald's expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it settled, like a hand laid flat on a table. Fences go down, he said. Wind, deer, wear and tear. These were cut, Cole said quietly. I repaired them this morning, clean cuts. 3 sections. Wire ends were fresh. You were out at the Callaway property this morning. Not a question. A notation. Yes, sir. She called me last night. I went out and fixed the fence and came back to talk to Ray about the cattle. Cole, pause it. I'd like to take them back to her today. No fee. Gerald looked at him for a long moment. The mockingbird was going again somewhere. The same one from the Callaway place? Maybe. Or one just like it. The morning had gone fully hot now. The kind of flat, pressing heat that settles over West Texas like a lid. You went out to our property on your own time, Gerald said slowly. Repaired her fence. And now you're standing on my porch asking me to waive a legitimate impound fee. Yes, sir. Because you believe the fence was deliberately cut. I know it was. Another pause. Longer this time. Gerald set down his coffee cup with a careful precision that had nothing to do with the cup. Cole, you've been a good hand. I want to be straightforward with you because of that. Margaret Callaway is sitting on land that has significant value to this operation. I've made her a fair offer. A generous offer. She's an elderly widow with no heirs and no viable operation. Sooner or later, that property comes to market. I intend to be ready when it does. He let that settle. What I don't intend is for my own employees to complicate that process. The word complicate sat in the air between them. I'm not trying to complicate anything, Cole said. I'm asking you to do right by a woman whose husband worked this county his whole life. You're asking me to send cattle back without a fee after trespassing. I'm asking you to stop cutting her fence. The silence that followed was of a different quality than the ones before it. Gerald Dunfield stood up from his chair, slowly, fully, in a way that was clearly meant to be felt as a shift in atmosphere. Go back to work, Cole, he said. His voice had gone flat and quiet. We're done here. The cattle are going to stay where they are until the fee is paid. His eyes held Cole's without blinking. And if I hear you've been on the Callaway property again without my authorization, you and I are going to have a very different conversation than this one. Cole looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded once, not in agreement, but in the way a man nods when he's understood something completely, and walked back to his truck. He drove to the east holding pen, opened the gate, loaded the 2 Callaway cattle into his trailer, and drove them back to Margaret. He was pulling out of the Callaway gate when his phone rang. Ray Pratt's number. You're done, Ray said, without introduction. Gerald says, clean out your locker. You're off the property by 3. Cole pulled the truck to the side of the road, through the windshield. The Texas plains ran flat to the horizon, heat already shimmering at the edges of things. All right, he said. That's it. All right. What else would you like me to say? Ray, a pause. Then, you're a damn fool. Merritt. Maybe, Cole said. And hung up. He sat there for a minute, with the engine idling and the air conditioning running, and the radio off. Outside, the land was enormous and quiet and utterly unmoved by what had just happened. That was the thing about this country. It didn't care. It had been here before Gerald Dunfield, and it would be here after him. And it received all human drama with the same flat, sunlit indifference. Cole Merritt had just lost the job he'd held for 11 years. He put the truck in drive and went to pick up his things. By the time he'd cleared out his locker and driven off Dunfield land for what appeared to be the last time, it was just past noon. He stopped at the roadside diner on Route 9, a low-ceilinged place with vinyl booths and a pie case that was always better than it looked, and ordered coffee and a chicken sandwich and sat by the window. Within 40 minutes, he'd gotten 4 phone calls. The first was from Danny Ortiz, a fence hand who'd worked the Dunfield South pasture for 3 years. He'd heard what happened from 2 other hands who'd been nearby when Ray made the call. You okay? Danny asked. Fine, Cole said. That's bull. What they did, Denny said. Cutting the widow's fence. That's low. It is, Cole agreed. The second call was from Walt Briggs, who ran a small cow-calf operation 12 miles north and had known Cole since they were in high school together in Odessa. Walt had also heard news traveled in Harlan County the way weather did. Fast and total. Need a place to stay? Walt asked. I've got my trailer, Cole said. He rented a single wide on the edge of a property outside of town. Nothing fancy, but it was his. Need work. I'll be all right for a while. Go. Walt's voice dropped slightly. You know what Gerald's doing to that woman? I know. People around here know too. A pause. I'm just saying. There's people who've been watching Gerald Dunfield run roughshod over this county for 20 years and waiting for a reason to say something about it. Cole drank his coffee and looked out the window at the highway. A cattle truck went by, northbound, trailing a long banner of dust. I'm not looking to make trouble, Walt, he said. Sometimes trouble finds you, whether you're looking or not, Walt said. After he hung up, Cole sat for a long time with the coffee going cold and the sandwich half. He thought about Roy Calloway dying face down in his pasture. He thought about Margaret standing on her porch with 2 mugs of coffee, her spine straight and her voice controlled. He thought about 11 years of sunrises over Dunfield land, the weight of a good horse under him, the satisfaction of work done right. Then he paid his check, left a decent tip, and drove home. He didn't know that by the following morning, 10 pickup trucks would be parked in a line outside Dunfield's front gate. The town of Kirby Falls, Texas, had a population of 4,211 people according to the last census, though locals would tell you the real number depended heavily on what you counted. They were the families who'd been there 5 generations. Who could name the exact year their great-grandparents built their homes? There were the ranch workers who came with the seasons. There were the newer arrivals, a scattering of retirees from San Antonio and Dallas who'd bought land cheap and built weekend homes and were slowly, politely and then there were people like Cole Merritt, not from Kirby Falls exactly, but woven into it. Part of its daily fabric, the way a particular fence post becomes part of a view without anyone deciding that it should. Kirby Falls had 1 diner, 1 hardware store, 1 feed supply, 1 bank, a post office that doubled as a notary, and a Baptist church that was the oldest building in town and showed it. It had a high school football team that had been mediocre for decades and a volunteer fire department that was excellent. It had Gerald Dunfield, who sat on the county commissioner's board, donated generously to local causes in ways that were always public and always calculated, and was understood by everyone to be the most powerful private individual in Harlan County, whether you liked him or not. Most people in Kirby Falls neither liked nor disliked Gerald Dunfield the way you like or dislike a person. They regarded him the way they regarded the weather or the price of beef, as a force that shaped the conditions of life without being subject to opinion that had been changing slowly for some time, and Cole Merritt's firing accelerated the change considerably. The information moved through Kirby Falls, the way information always moves through small towns, not through any single channel, but through the aggregate of dozens of small conversations that together constitute the town's living memory. It moved through the roadside diner, where Cole had been seen sitting alone after his firing, and where Darla Hutchins, the afternoon waitress who'd been working there for 19 years, connected the dots and started filling in the rest. It moved through the feed supply, where Danny Ortiz stopped in that afternoon and told Bobby Reese, the owner, what he'd witnessed. It moved through the parking lot of the Baptist church, where Wednesday evening Bible study had just let out, and 3 women stood talking by their cars for 40 minutes longer than they'd intended. By 9 o'clock that Wednesday evening, most of Kirby Falls that was inclined to care already cared. What gave this story particular traction wasn't just the firing, though people found that outrageous enough. It was the detail about the fence. That detail, the image of someone going out in the night and cutting a dead man's widow's fence with wire cutters so that her cattle would wander and she'd have to pay to get them back. That detail did something to people. It was the specific smallness of it, the meanness of the method, that stripped away any remaining pretense that Gerald Dunfield was simply a hard businessman operating within the bounds of acceptable practice. A man who would do that to a 61-year-old widow 7 months after her husband's death was not engaged in business. He was engaged in something else. Walt Briggs drove to Cole's trailer that evening around 7. Cole was on the small porch with a beer, watching the last of the light drained out of the western sky. Walt's truck kicked up dust on the approach road, and he parked and climbed out with the unease of a man who spent his whole life on the same piece of land and is nowhere urgent to be. Walt was 51, stocky and strong, with a white mustache and sun-creased eyes, and the kind of slow speech that people who didn't know him sometimes mistook for a slowness of mind. Cole had known him since they were 17. He was among the most precise thinkers Cole had ever encountered. Walt sat in the spare chair and accepted the beer Cole passed him without comment. They sat in silence for a while. "The way old friends can. I talked to 9 people today," Walt said eventually, without trying. "About what happened?" "About what happened?" Walt took a long drink. "You know, Bobby Reese has been having trouble with Dunfield for 2 years." Cole glanced at him. Bobby Reese owned the feed supply, but he also ran about 200 head on a property that bordered Dunfield's northern range. Cole hadn't known there was trouble. "Water rights," Walt said. "Gerald's lawyer sent Bobby a letter 14 months ago claiming a historical easement over the creek that runs along the north fence. Bobby's had water rights to that creek since 1987. But the letter was official and formal and referenced about 6 legal statutes. And Bobby's not a rich man, and lawyers cost money." Walt shook his head. "Bobby's been dealing with it quietly because he doesn't want the attention." "How many others?" Cole asked. Walt was quiet for a moment. "I think you'd be surprised." Cole set down his beer. The sky was purple dark now, the first stars appearing. The kind of sky that in another context might be described as beautiful, and that tonight simply felt like the world continuing on without him. "I'm not trying to start something," Cole said. "I know that," Walt said. "But I think something might be starting whether you try or not." He paused. "There's a woman, Nancy Vance, runs this small cattle operation out past Miller Road with her son after her husband left. She called me this afternoon. She heard what you did. Going out to fix the fence, getting the cattle back," she said. He stopped, collected the words carefully. "She said it's been a long time since she saw somebody in this county do something decent and pay for it. She said that matters to her." Cole looked at his hands. They were still marked from the morning's fence work, a thin red line across one palm where the wire had caught. "People are angry," Walt continued. "Not because you got fired, necessarily. Because they've been watching Gerald Dunfield operate for 20 years, and they've been making their own quiet calculations about what they'd put up with and what they wouldn't. And for a lot of them, this," he gestured vaguely, "this is what they wouldn't." They sat in silence again. A coyote called somewhere in the middle distance, the sound rising and then dissolving. "What are you thinking?" Cole asked. "Dear, I'm thinking that tomorrow morning, maybe some people decide to take a drive out past the Dunfield front gate," Walt said simply. "Nothing more complicated than that." Margaret Calloway heard about Cole's firing before dinner time. She called him twice. He let both calls go to voicemail. On the third call, he picked up. "You should not have done that," she said immediately. "The cattle are back," he said. "Cole, you lost your job. I know. That man will make your life difficult. You don't know what he's capable of." Cole thought about that. He thought about 11 years of working for Gerald Dunfield, of seeing how the man operated, the quiet ways he applied pressure, the infrastructure of influence he'd built over decades, the county commissioner seat, the relationships with the bank, the lawyer in Midland who knew every regulation and every statute, and had spent 20 years finding ways to make them work in one direction. "I have some idea," Cole said quietly. Margaret was silent for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. The control was still there, but underneath it was something that might have been grief or might have been its opposite. "Roy always said you were the best hand he ever saw," she said. "He meant the person, not just the work." Cole didn't say anything. "Don't let that man bury you," she said. "That's all I ask." By 10 o'clock that night, Walt Briggs had made 11 phone calls. He'd called ranchers, farmers, former ranch hands, 2 retired teachers who were also landowners, and a woman named Patricia Harmon, who was 67 years old and had been publicly protesting Gerald Dunfield's water rights, maneuvering for the past 3 years without anyone paying much attention. He'd been methodical and direct and asked each person a simple question. "How do you feel about what happened today?" Every single person had an answer. Most of them had more than one. He didn't propose a plan. He didn't organize anything formally. He simply told each person that he would be driving his truck out to the Dunfield front gate the following morning at sun, and that if they felt the way he did, they were welcome to join him. Then he went to bed. Nancy Vance didn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table in the small farmhouse on Miller Road with a cup of tea going cold, and her son Tyler, who was 19 and had his father's jaw and his mother's stubbornness sitting across from her. She'd told him what had happened, and he'd listened in the particular intense silence of a young man, absorbing information that confirms what he already suspected about how the world worked. "So, we're going," Tyler said. It wasn't a question. "You have to be up at 4:30 to move the cattle," Nancy said. "I'll move them first." She looked at her son. He'd been working the property since he was 12. Doing the work of a grown man since he was 16. He was 19 now with no savings, no college plans he could afford, and a future that looked like the same flat stretch of hard work that his parents' lives had been without. It appeared, the partnership that had made it bearable. "Yes," she said. "We're going." Danny Ortiz, who had called Cole from the Dunfield property that afternoon, did not call Walt Briggs that evening. He'd heard, through the network, that some people were planning to gather in the morning. He sat in the bunkhouse he shared with 2 other hands, both of whom were also aware of what was happening, and he thought about his job and his green card situation, which was solid, but which he had learned over years in this country to treat as a consideration that others might attempt to make relevant if they wished to apply pressure. He thought about Roy Calloway, who had driven him to the county hospital once in the middle of the night without asking any questions. When Danny had broken 2 fingers in a gate accident and had no one else to call, he thought about Cole Merritt, who had trained him in his first year and never once talked to him the way some of the other hands did. Never made him feel like a guest in a place he was expected to work in but not belong to. Then he went to sleep. He was up at 4:15 the next morning. Bobby Reese locked the feed supply at 9 that evening and sat in his office in the back for a long time. The letter from Gerald's lawyer was in a manila folder in the bottom drawer of his desk. He'd read it so many times in the past 14 months that he'd memorized most of it. It was 8 pages long, full of legal language that sounded definitive and official, and his own lawyer, a general practice attorney in Odessa, who handled mostly real estate closings and estate work, had told him it would cost between $8,000 and $15,000 to contest, with no guarantee of outcome. $8,000 to $15,000. Bobby Reese did not have $8,000 to $15,000 in a liquid position. He had a mortgage on the property, 2 employees, a truck payment, and about $4,000 in savings that he thought of as the buffer between life as he knew it and a version of life he didn't want to think about. He had not told anyone about the letter, except his wife and his lawyer. He'd absorbed the situation quietly, as he'd absorbed many things quietly, because that was the disposition of a man who'd grown up in a county where Gerald Dunfield was simply a fact of the landscape. He opened the bottom drawer and looked at the manila folder for a while. Then he picked up his phone and called Walt Briggs. "I'll be there at sunrise," he said. When Walt answered, "I'm glad," Walt said simply. Cole Merritt went to bed at 10:30 and lay in the dark for a while, listening to the trailer settle in the night wind. He didn't know about Walt's calls. He didn't know about Nancy Vance and his son, or Bobby Reese and his folder, or Danny Ortiz lying awake in the bunk. He didn't know that Patricia Harmon had spent the evening calling. the 3 local journalists she'd cultivated over years of activism, or that one of them, a young woman from the Harlan County Gazette named Sasha Moreno, had already started making notes. He knew only that he had done what he believed was right, and that it had cost him a job he'd held for 11 years, and that the ground ahead was uncertain. He was 38 years old with a truck, a trailer, some savings, and a set of skills that were real and transferable, but not in this specific county. Easy to deploy without Gerald Dunfield's awareness. He understood that he was not, in the conventional sense, in a strong position. He fell asleep anyway, because he was tired and because the situation would be what it would be. And lying awake, adding up its dimensions in the dark, wouldn't change the sum. He woke Achi 5:15 when his phone began to ring. It was Walt. "You should probably get dressed," Walt said, "and drive out to the Dunfield front gate." "Why?" Cole asked, still half asleep. "Because there are already 8 trucks here," Walt said, "and I think there are more coming." The Dunfield Ranch's main gate was a structure designed to communicate permanence and authority. It was a wide iron gate set between 2 stone pillars, each pillar topped with a cast iron D, the Dunfield brand. The gate was the entrance to a half-mile gravel drive that led to the main house, and it was flanked on either side by fresh white fencing that ran as far as the eye could see in both directions. It was the kind of entrance that said, without ambiguity, "This land belongs to someone who intends to keep it." When Cole pulled his truck off the county road and onto the wide gravel shoulder in front of the gate at 5:48 in the morning, there were 9 trucks already there. He sat in his cab for a moment, engine idling, taking it in. They were parked in a loose but deliberate line facing the gate, not blocking the entrance, but present in a way that was impossible to ignore. Walt's truck was at the center of the line. Bobby Reese's battered red Chevy was there, along with a white GMC that Cole recognized as Nancy Vance's. Danny Ortiz was there in his own vehicle, a development that Cole hadn't expected and that settled something in his chest. There were ranchers he recognized, and 1 or 2 faces he knew only vaguely. A man named Curtis Alderman, who ran a small horse operation east of town. A woman with white hair and determined eyes, whom he would later learn was Patricia Harmon. He climbed out of his truck. Walt was standing at the front of his vehicle, coffee in hand, and he nodded. When Cole approached, "10th truck," he said. Cole looked down the line. Some people were out of their vehicles, standing and talking in the early morning quiet. Others were still inside, visible through windshields. There was no noise, no shouting, no signs. Just 10 trucks on the public shoulder of a county road outside the entrance to the most powerful private property in Harlan County, parked there in the gray, cool hour before the full sun arrived. "What do people want?" Cole asked. "To be seen," Walt said. He thought about it and added, "and for Gerald to see them." Inside the main house, Gerald Dunfield was informed of the situation at 6:04 by Ray Pratt, who had gotten a call from the gate security camera monitoring service, which sent an automated alert whenever vehicles congregated in the gate area. Gerald was in his kitchen in a bathrobe, on his first cup of coffee, when Ray called. "How many?" Gerald asked. 10 trucks, Ray said. "All locals?" "I've identified most of them. Walt Briggs is there. Bobby Riz. A couple of hands from the South operation, including Ortiz." A pause. Cole Merritt just arrived. Gerald set down his coffee cup with the same careful precision he'd used the day before. "Are they on my land?" "No." "Public shoulder. Are they blocking the gate?" "No." "Then they're not trespassing, and there's nothing to be done," Gerald said. His voice was even. Called Carter Weiss. Carter Weiss was his lawyer in Midland, at 6 in the morning. "He's paid to be available," Gerald said, and hung up. He stood at his kitchen window for a moment, looking out at the eastern pasture, where the light was just beginning to gather. 10 trucks. He counted them in his mind, matched them to names, 2 properties, 2 existing relationships, and leverage points. Bobby Reese. He thought about the letter. Walt Briggs. Walt had no existing dispute with him, which was mildly interesting. Ortiz. That was a concern, because if hands on his own property were involved, the interior was less stable than it appeared. Merritt, of course, 10 trucks. In 20 years of operating in this county, Gerald Dunfield had managed opposition the way you manage anything, by making it individually costly. One person at a time, one dispute at a time, one quiet letter or one quiet conversation about lending terms, or one quiet word to an employer. The architecture of his influence in this county was built precisely to prevent collective action, because collective action was the only form of opposition he couldn't address with a lawyer and a checkbook. 10 trucks at 6 in the morning was something different. He went to get dressed. Sasha Moreno from the Harlan County Gazette arrived at 6:20 with a camera and a notebook. She was 27 years old, had been at the paper for 2 years, and had spent most of those 2 years writing about county commissioner meetings and high school sports results. Patricia Harmon had called her at 11 the previous night, and she'd been awake since, for thinking about what she'd been told and what it might mean. She parked behind the last truck in the line and walked the length of it slowly, taking photographs of the vehicles and the gate and the stone pillars with the cast iron Ds catching the early light. She stopped and talked to people as she went short exchanges. Names and brief statements, and she wrote everything down in a narrow reporter's notebook with a mechanical pencil. When she reached Cole Merritt, she introduced herself and asked him directly, "Why are you here?" Cole looked at her for a moment. He wasn't a man who performed 4 cameras or prepared statements. He said what he thought because a woman whose husband just died is being pushed off her land, he said. And somebody should be here to say that's not right. Sasha wrote it down word for word. "Do you think this changes anything?" she asked. Cole looked down the line of trucks. The sun was coming up fully now, painting everything gold and long-shadowed. The trucks gleamed. The people stood or leaned or sat, patient and present, their faces turned toward the gate. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but it's the truth, and the truth should be said out loud." She photographed him standing in front of his truck with the gate behind him, and the image, a lean, weathered man in a work shirt with 10 trucks lined up behind him in the Iron D, visible over his shoulder, would run on the front page of the Harlan County Gazette the following morning and be shared 4,000 times on social media by the end of the week. Gerald Dunfield came out of his house at 7:15. He had dressed carefully, good boots, pressed shirt, the Rolex. He drove his own truck down the half-mile gravel drive and stopped at the inside of the gate, engine running, and looked through the iron bars at the line of vehicles on the other side. He sat in his truck for a long time. People in the line saw him and went quiet, the conversations tapering off one by one until everyone was watching. Sasha Moreno raised her camera. Gerald and Cole were separated by 20 feet of gravel and an iron gate. Gerald's hands were on the steering wheel. Cole was standing with his arms at his sides, hat on, not performing anything, just present. Neither of them spoke after about 90 seconds, which felt, to everyone watching, considerably longer than 90 seconds. Gerald Dunfield put his truck in reverse and drove back up to the house. The line of trucks didn't move. Carter Weiss called Gerald and said, "They're on public land," Weiss said. "There's nothing actionable unless they block the entrance or engage in harassment." "You cannot compel them to leave." "I'm not interested in compelling them to leave," Gerald said. He was back in the house, in his office, which was a large room lined with bookshelves and mounted heads and framed photographs of Gerald with every Republican governor of Texas for the past 3 administrations. "I'm interested in understanding what they want." "It seems fairly clear what they want," Weiss said carefully. "A symbolic gesture," Gerald said. "They want to feel like they did something." "Fine. Let them sit there." He paused. "What's our exposure on the fence issue?" A longer pause from Weiss. "If someone can prove that the fence was deliberately cut by a person acting on your behalf or at your direction, that's criminal mischief, potentially civil liability on top of that. It depends on what can be proven and by whom." "It can't be proven," Gerald said. Another pause from Weiss that Gerald didn't entirely like. "I'd recommend moving carefully," Weiss said. "The Callaway situation has more visibility now than it did yesterday morning." "I'm aware of that," Gerald said. "There's something else," Weiss said. "Bobby Reese is out there." Gerald said nothing. "Bobby Reese has been sitting on a legitimate grievance for 14 months, Weiss continued. "If he decides to make the water rights dispute public, if he talks to the woman from the Gazette, for instance, the framing becomes considerably less favorable for us. It's not just the widow and the ranch hand at that point. It's a pattern." Gerald looked at the photograph on the wall of himself and the governor, both of them grinning in front of a barbecue pit at a fundraiser in Austin 3 years ago. He thought about patterns. "Set up a meeting," he said, "with Reese this week, and the Calloway situation." A long silence. "I'll handle it," Gerald said. By 8:30, there were 12 trucks. 2 more had arrived. A man named Leonard Fouts, who ran cattle east of town and had no particular dispute with Gerald, but had heard what happened and driven out. And a retired school teacher named Carolyn Drake, who was 72 years old and had taught half the county, including Cole Merritt, in 8th grade English, and had driven out in a 2019 Silverado that she maintained with exceptional care. She parked at the end of the line and sat in her truck and folded her hands in her lap and watched the gate, and no one asked her to explain herself because none was needed. Word had reached Margaret Calloway by 7, through a call from Nancy Vance. Margaret had listened to the description of the trucks, the gate, the line of people, and had not said anything for a long time. "He's still there?" she asked finally. "Cole, he's there," Nancy said. "He was the 10th truck. There are 12 now." Margaret was quiet again. Through the phone, Nancy could hear the particular quality of silence of a house where someone has recently died. A sound that isn't quite a sound, but that anyone who has experienced it recognizes immediately. "Tell him Margaret started, and then stopped. Tell him Roy would have been the 11th truck," she said. Nancy relayed the message. When Cole heard it, he turned away from the group for a moment and looked out over the flatland to the south, where the Calloway property sat just out of sight. His jaw was tight. He stood like that for about 10 seconds, and then he turned back. "Tell her she doesn't owe me anything," he said. "She knows that," Nancy said. "That's not what she's saying." The trucks stayed until 11 o'clock. No one had organized a departure time. It simply became clear, collectively, that the point had been made, and that remaining beyond a certain hour shifted the nature of the gesture from powerful to performative. Walt Briggs's truck pulled out first, and others followed gradually. And by 11:15, the county road shoulder was empty, except for some tire tracks in the gravel. Sasha Moreno stayed until the last truck left. She had pages of notes and 24 photographs, and a growing sense that she was writing a story considerably larger than the Harlan County Gazette usually carried. She drove back to the office and spent the afternoon writing. The piece ran online that evening and in print the next morning. The headline read, "Ranch Hand Fired for Helping Widow Neighbors Respond." It was the most read story the Gazette had published in 11 years. Gerald Dunfield did not appear publicly for the rest of that day. Ray Pratt called twice with updates. The trucks had left. There was no damage, no incident. Gerald listened and said little. That afternoon, he called his daughter, Rebecca, who lived in Austin and worked as a corporate attorney for an energy firm. He called her rarely. Their relationship was cordial and managed and had been both those things since. Rebecca was about 16 and had decided, without drama, that her father was a man she admired in certain respects and did not like in others, and that those two facts could coexist. "I've got a situation," he said. "I heard," she said. "It's been shared about 1,200 times on social media as of an hour ago." He said nothing. "Dad," her voice was careful, "is what they're saying true?" "About the fans. Property disputes are complicated," he said. "That's not an answer." "It's the answer I have," he said. A pause. "I think you need to think carefully about what you want the next chapter of your life to look like," Rebecca said, "because right now, the story that's being told about you is a specific one, and the longer it goes uncontested, the more it becomes the permanent version." After he hung up, Gerald sat in his office for a long time. On the shelf opposite his desk was a framed photograph of his father, Charles Dunn, standing in front of the original ranch house in 1971, with a young Gerald at his side, both of them squinting against the sun. Charles Dunfield had built this operation from 400 acres and a bank loan, through drought and debt and the long hard work of a man who believed that the land was the only real thing and that everything else, money, reputation, relationships, was downstream of it. Gerald looked at the photograph and thought about permanence, about what he was building and what, in the process of building it, he was becoming. He picked up the phone and called Carter Weiss. "Set up a meeting with Margaret Calloway," he said. "I want to talk directly." Weiss paused. "About the property offer." "About everything," Gerald said. The meeting was set for Thursday morning at 10 o'clock at the roadside diner on Route 9, a location that Gerald would not have chosen, but that Margaret Calloway specified through a brief two-sentence reply to Weiss's formal written request. She would come to the diner. She would not come to his property, and she would not receive him at hers. Gerald arrived 7 minutes early, which was unusual for him. He sat in a booth in the back, ordered coffee, and waited. Ray Pratt wanted to come. Gerald had told him no. Weiss wanted to attend. Gerald had told him to be available by phone. This was, he had decided, a conversation he needed to have himself. Marguerite arrived exactly at 10, with Nancy Vance beside her, which Gerald had not expected. Nancy was 44 and carried herself like a woman who had learned to take up exactly as much space as she needed, and not apologize for any of it. She sat beside Margaret without introduction, opened a small notebook, and laid a pen next to it. Gerald looked at the notebook and then at Margaret. Margaret looked back at him with the brown eyes behind the wire-rimmed glasses, clear and direct and patient in the way of a woman who has nothing to prove and nowhere else she'd rather be. "Mrs. Calloway," he said. "Mr. Dunfield," she said. "Darla." Hutchins brought coffee. Without being asked, she'd been pouring coffee in this diner for 19 years and could read a table in 4 seconds, and then made herself absent with professional discretion. Gerald wrapped both hands around the mug. He was a man accustomed to controlling conversations, and this one had already arranged itself in a way that gave him less leverage than he was used to. He made a decision, in that moment, to do something he rarely did. Begin honestly. "The fence," he said. "I didn't order that." Margaret and Nancy both looked at him. Neither spoke. "I want to be clear about that," he continued. "What I ordered, or what I authorized, was an offer. A purchase offer, through Weiss. That's a legitimate business inquiry." He paused. "The fence? If someone in my operation was responsible for that, that happened without my direct knowledge." "Without your direct knowledge," Margaret repeated. Her voice was absolutely level. "Yes." "Did you know it had happened?" "A beat. I had information that suggested the fence had gone down," he said carefully. "And you chose to impound my cattle. Ray made that call." "Ray Pratt does not make calls that you haven't. Achisomi Point made clear to him that you'd approve of," Margaret said. Her voice hadn't changed in volume or tone, but something in it had crystallized. "I've been living next to your operation for 15 years, Mr. Dunfield. I know how Ray Pratt operates. I know he is a man who executes the spirit of instructions rather than the letter, because that way the letter can always be disavowed." Gerald looked at her for a long moment. He was 64 years old and had been in rooms with difficult people his entire adult life. Lawyers, bankers, politicians, competitors. He had almost never been made to feel, by the quality of someone's attention, that he was fully seen. Margaret Calloway's gaze had the particular quality of a person for whom clarity was a moral commitment. "What do you want from this conversation?" he asked. "I want to know if you intend to continue," she said simply. "The fence? The impound fees? The letters through your lawyer? I want to know if this is going to continue." "I want to purchase your property," he said. "That's a legitimate." "I'm not selling," she said. "I told your lawyer that 6 weeks ago. Roy is buried in the backfield. I'm not leaving. If you make another offer, the answer will be the same." She paused. What I'm asking is whether you're going to keep making my life difficult until I break, because I want you to understand something clearly. I'm not going to break. The diner was quiet around them. Darla Hutchins was at the counter, pretending to reorganize the pie case and absorbing every word with the focused attention of a woman who understood that some conversations are history. Gerald looked at his coffee. He thought about the trucks outside his gate. He thought about Sasha Marino's article, which had been picked up by 2 regional papers and a San Antonio news blog. He thought about what Rebecca had said about the permanent version of a story. The situation with Cole Merritt, he said. Margaret said nothing, waiting. That was handled poorly, Charles said. He found the was difficult in a way he hadn't anticipated. He was not a man who used phrases like handled poorly to describe his own actions, and the unfamiliarity of the posture made his chest tighten in a way that wasn't pain exactly, but was adjacent to it. He acted according to his conscience, and I responded to it as insubordination. He stopped. That wasn't right. Nancy Vance wrote something in her notebook. Will you offer him his job back? Margaret asked. I will, Gerald said. And then, because he was still Gerald Dunfield, whether he'd take it is a different question. It is, Margaret agreed, but the offer matters, regardless. They were quiet for a moment. Outside the window of the diner, Route 9 ran flat and straight into the heat shimmer, the way it always had. I'm not going to pursue the property any further, Gerald said. It cost them something to say it. Not money, but something. The offer is withdrawn. If you ever decide to sell, you know how to reach Weiss. But I won't apply additional pressure. Margaret looked at him steadily. And the water rights dispute with Bobby Reese? Gerald blinked. How do you? Because Bobby Reese is a neighbor, she said quietly. And neighbors talk, especially when they're parked outside your gate at sunrise. Gerald absorbed this. He thought about the meeting Weiss had set up with Reese, scheduled for the following Tuesday. He thought about the letter in the bottom drawer that had been sitting there for 14 months, collecting the particular weight of fear and silence and financial anxiety. He thought about what it meant to have built a life on this land, on the real, physical, demanding fact of this land, and to have spent the last decade arranging that land's resources as instruments of leverage. I'll have Weiss withdraw the easement claim, he said. Nancy Vance wrote it down. Gerald noticed. You're going to hold me to this, he said. It wasn't quite an objection. We're going to hold you to this, Nancy said, speaking for the first time in the conversation, and her voice was neither hostile nor warm. It was simply certain. Gerald nodded slowly. He finished his coffee. He stood up, left cash on the table for the check, and said, Mrs. Calloway, with what was, for him, as close to deference as his architecture allowed. Margaret nodded. She did not offer her hand. Neither did he. Some reconciliations don't include that gesture, and both of them understood it. Cole Merritt heard about the meeting from Walt, who heard from Nancy, who called him from the parking lot of the diner still holding the notebook. Cole was at his trailer, going through his options. He'd had 2 calls about work, one from a ranch operation in Pecos County and one from a horse training operation closer to Midland. Neither was in Kirby Falls. Both were real possibilities. He sat with the phone in his hand after Walt told him, looking out the trailer window at the flatland and the mesquite trees and the sky that was, on this particular afternoon, a deep and flawless blue. He's going to offer the job back, Walt said. I know, Cole said. Are you going to take it? A long silence. Cole thought about the gate. He thought about Ray Pratt's face in the equipment barn. He thought about standing on Gerald Dunfield's back porch and saying, I know it was cut, and the quality of silence that had followed. He thought about 11 years. The early mornings, the horses, the satisfaction of work done right on land that deserved it. I don't know, he said. That's an honest answer, Walt said. I keep thinking about something, Cole said. I keep thinking that the land doesn't care who works it. It just needs working. What I was good at, all of it. I can do that somewhere else. That's true, Walt said. But what happened here, Cole continued, with the trucks, with Margaret that happened here? It happened to these specific people. In this specific county, because of a specific thing one person did that turned out to matter. He paused. I don't know what to do with that. You don't have to do anything with it, Walt said. It already happened. Gerald called Ray Pratt that evening and had the conversation he'd been building toward for 2 days. He did it directly, without a lawyer, which was his preferred method for things he wanted to remain unambiguous. He told Ray that his handling of the Calloway situation, the implicit approval of methods that couldn't be put in writing, had created consequences that were costly and ongoing, and that Ray's judgment had proven, in this specific instance, to be more liability than asset. Ray listened. He started to defend himself twice. Gerald let him finish both times before continuing. By the end, Ray understood that his position on the ranch had changed and that the change was permanent. You're not fired, Gerald said, but you're not foreman anymore. If you want to stay on in another capacity, that conversation is available. If not, I'll give you a fair severance and a reference that reflects your tenure accurately. Ray was quiet for a long moment. Then, you're throwing me under the bus. I'm holding you accountable, Gerald said. Those are different things. You knew, Ray said. His voice had gone tight and low. You knew what I was doing. You didn't say stop. I didn't say do it either, Gerald said. And that distinction is going to have to be enough for you, because it's all I have to offer. Another silence. Ray Pratt was not a deep man, but he was not entirely stupid, and he understood, perhaps for the first time with real clarity, the nature of the arrangement he'd been operating inside. He had been useful. He had been deniable. He had confused those two things with security, and they were not the same. I'll take the severance, Ray said flatly. All right, Gerald said. Bobby Reese received a letter from Carter Weiss on Friday morning. It was 2 paragraphs long. It withdrew the easement claim. It cited, with elegant vagueness, a review of historical documentation that had produced conclusions inconsistent with the original position. It did not include an apology. Bobby read it twice at his kitchen table, and then he called his wife into the room and read it to her, and she put both hands over her mouth. He called Walt Briggs to tell him, and Walt called Cole. Cole was at the hardware store when he got the call, buying fence staples he didn't specifically need but had decided to buy anyway. Because buying fence staples was a thing a man who intended to keep working did. Bobby got the letter, Walt said. Cole stood in the middle of the hardware store aisle with the staples in one hand and his phone in the other. Good, he said. Gerald offered your job back. Through Weiss this morning, Walt added. Official letter. Full reinstatement. Cole looked at the fence staples. I'll think about it, he said. What are you going to do if you don't take it? Work, Cole said simply. Same as always. Margaret Calloway drove out to the backfield that afternoon. The field was small and flat, the grass sparse in the way of land that received enough rain to be alive, but not enough to be generous. Roy's grave was marked with a simple headstone, Gray Gronicia's name and dates, and a single line that Margaret had chosen herself. He knew how to work this land. It was, she had decided when she chose it, the most complete thing she could say about him. She stood at the grave for a long time without speaking. The air was still and hot. In the distance, she could hear the sound of Dunfield cattle, a low, collective murmur that had been the background sound of this property for 15 years. She thought about Roy, who had worked beside Gerald Dunfield's workers for decades and never had illusions about who Gerald Dunfield was, but who had believed quietly, stubbornly, without making speeches about it, that the correct response to a powerful man's indifference was to do your own work well, to maintain your own fence, to know your own land. She thought about Cole Merritt, who had come out on his day off to fix a fence that wasn't his to fix. She put her hand on the headstone and didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say that Roy didn't already know. 3 weeks passed. The county moved through them the way it moved through all weeks, with the slow, particular rhythm of agricultural life, which is organized not by the clock, but by the requirements of living things. The story in the Harlan County Gazette had rippled outward, and then as stories do, had settled back into the broader fabric of regional news. Sasha Moreno had been contacted by a journalist at the San Antonio Express News who was writing a larger piece about land. Pressure on small agricultural operations across Texas. She'd given the contact to Margaret and to Bobby Reese, and both of them had agreed to be interviewed, and a piece was scheduled to run the following month. Cole Merritt did not take his job back. He'd thought about it seriously. He'd read the letter from Weiss 3 times, sat with it for 2 days, talked it through with Walt once over beers at Walt's kitchen table. The offer was genuine, and the terms were fair, and there was a version of the decision in which returning made sense. He knew the land. He knew the horses. He'd built 11 years of expertise in that specific operation. But when he tried to imagine driving back through Dunfield's gate every morning, past the stone pillars and the I&Ds, and down the half-mile gravel drive to the stable, he felt something that wasn't quite resistance, but was related to it. Not anger, not fear. Something quieter, the sense that a chapter had closed in the way chapters close when they close correctly, and that walking back through the door would be walking backward through the page. He wrote a short letter declining the offer. He thanked Gerald Dunfield for the years of employment. He wished the operation well. He kept it to 3 sentences, because 3 sentences was all the situation required. He'd taken a position with the horse training operation outside Midland. A woman named Diane Fulcher, who ran a 30-stall facility focused on cutting horse training and competition prep. The work was different from ranch work in ways that were interesting rather than difficult. More individual, more specific. Diane was exacting and knowledgeable and treated her hands like professionals, which Cole found, after 11 years, of a different kind of management, quietly remarkable. The drive from Kirby Falls to Midland was 40 minutes. He kept his trailer where it was. He kept his life in Kirby Falls because Kirby Falls was where his life was. And he understood now, more clearly than he had before, that his life was not the job. It was the place and the people and the specific texture of a landscape that he'd been walking for years, without fully knowing that it belonged to him in the way that places belong to the people who attend to them. Margaret Calloway's fence was in excellent repair. 3 of the men who'd been in the truck line, Danny Ortiz, Curtis Alderman, and a young man from Walt's operation named Pete Calhoun had come out on a Saturday morning in June, 3 weeks after the gate event, and spent half a day restringing and reinforcing the entire northern boundary. They'd brought their own wire and their own tools and declined payment. Margaret had fed them lunch and iced tea and thanked them with a directness that made the thanks feel different from most thanks, more like a statement of fact than a pleasantry. The cattle were well. The 14 head moved through the summer pasture with the unhurried purpose of animals that don't know and don't need to know anything about property disputes or human drama. They were simply alive and grazing, which was what the land was for. Margaret had begun, tentatively, to consider the future. Not in large terms. She was not a person given to large terms, but in the practical, manageable increments that her situation permitted. She'd called her nephew in Amarillo, Roy's sister's son, a man named Howard Calloway, who was 33 and had been working construction but had grown up on a ranch and occasionally mentioned, without urgency, that he missed it. She'd asked him if he'd like to come for a visit. He'd said yes. He was coming in July. She wasn't making promises. She was opening a door. Gerald Dunfield had a conversation with his daughter Rebecca. Rebecca drove down from Austin on a Friday evening, and they had dinner on the covered porch, the same porch where Gerald had sat the morning. Cole came to talk to him, though that fact went unacknowledged. They drank iced tea and ate grilled chicken and watched the last light leave the eastern pasture. Rebecca was 36. Quick and precise, with her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness repackaged into something more conscious of itself. The relationship between them was the particular kind that forms when a person grows up loving a parent while disagreeing with them at a fundamental level, sturdy and complicated, and on both sides shot through with the ambivalence of people who understand each other too well for simple warmth. "You did the right thing," she said. Not warmly, but accurately. "I did the necessary thing," Gerald said. There was a distinction for him, and he wasn't sure yet whether it was an honest one or a defensive one. "Sometimes those are the same," Rebecca said. "Sometimes," he agreed. They were quiet for a while. Somewhere in the evening dark, the cattle moved. He could hear them faintly, the collective presence of the herd settling for the night. He'd been hearing that sound his whole life. It was as close to comfort as the land offered, and the land was not, in his experience, in the business of offering comfort. It was in the business of requiring things, work and attention and honesty and continuity. You gave those things to the land, and the land stayed. That was the deal. "What did it cost you?" Rebecca asked. Being honest with her, Gerald thought about it. He'd thought about it every day since the meeting at the diner. He thought about what he'd said that wasn't right, and the sensation of saying it, the specific weight of it. "Less than I expected," he said. Rebecca looked at him. "I thought it would feel like losing," he said. It didn't feel like losing. What did it feel like? He was quiet for a long time, looking at the pasture, like setting something down. He said that I'd been carrying it a long time. Cole drove out to the Callaway property on a Sunday in late June. He had no particular reason. He just thought of Margaret and of the fence and wanted to see that things were all right. He brought a coffee cake from the roadside diner because Darla Hutchins had told him. Margaret had mentioned once that she liked it, and because bringing something was the right way to show up. Margaret was in the garden behind the farmhouse when he arrived, pulling weeds from a vegetable bed with the focused, meditative quality of someone doing work that doesn't require thought but rewards attention. She stood up when she saw him and brushed the dirt from her gloves. She looked well, not dramatically different. The property was still small, and the farmhouse still needed paint, and the summer heat was pressing down hard in the way of West Texas June. But there was something in her posture that was different from the last time he'd seen her. Something that had settled or aligned, the way a load-bearing wall becomes more itself when the pressure on it resolves. They sat on the porch with coffee and the cake and talked for about an hour. She told him about Howard in Amarillo. She told him about the Express News interview, which she'd found less daunting than she'd expected. She told him that she'd gotten a card from Danny Ortiz after the fence work and that she'd kept it on the kitchen windowsill. Cole told her about the job in Midland, about Diane Fulcher and the cutting horses, about the particular satisfaction of training an animal that was already gifted but needed someone to help it understand what it was gifted at. He found, talking about it, that he was more enthusiastic than he'd expected, more alive to the new thing than he'd given himself credit for being. "You seem different," Margaret said. "Different how?" she considered. "Lighter," she said, like something got resolved. He thought about that. He thought about the morning he'd fixed the fence, the simple, physical work of it, the wire in his hands, the sun coming up. He thought about the drive to Dunfield's porch, the conversation, the firing. He thought about the trucks in the morning light. He thought about none of it having gone the way it would go if the world rewarded individual decency in any simple or reliable way. He'd lost his job. He'd had to start over. He'd spent 3 weeks uncertain about his future. And yet, "Roy's buried out back," he said. "Yes," Margaret said. "I think about that sometimes," he said. "A man who worked this land his whole life and is still in it." He paused. "That's not nothing." "No," she said. "It's not." They finished the coffee cake. A mockingbird went through its repertoire in the live oak by the barn. The same one, possibly, or one just like it. The afternoon heat pressed down and the land lay flat and enormous in every direction, patient and indifferent and full of everything that had happened on it and everything that would. Cole drove home on the county road, past the Dunfield gate with its stone pillars and iron Ds, past the roadside diner, past the feed supply and the hardware store and the Baptist church in its old building at the center of town. He drove with the window down and the wind coming through warm and steady, the way it always did in this country, moving across the flat ground with nothing to interrupt it. He was not rich. He was not powerful. He did not own the land he worked or the horses he trained or the fence lines he maintained. He had, by most measures, come through the past 3 weeks with less than he'd started with. But the trucks had been there. The trucks had been there, and everyone who'd been in them knew it. And the people whose land and water and dignity had been quietly pressured for years had stood in the early morning light outside that iron gate and been seen. And Margaret Calloway was in her garden pulling weeds. And Bobby Reese had his creek. And Roy Calloway was in the ground he'd loved. And Cole Merritt drove home through the late afternoon of a West Texas Sunday with the window down and the warm wind on his face, through country he knew by heart. And that was enough. That was, in the end, exactly enough.